How is money created, controlled, and manipulated? From ancient Egypt and the Shang dynasty to the rise and fall of the Romans and the Persians, the Mongol and Byzantine empires, right through to the expansion of the world's first truly global world orders, the British and now the US. Thousands of years of empires capturing control of money, manipulating the creation of money through debasement, and then collapsing under the pressures of inflation, rising debt, and disintegration of trust. Modern human civilization has reached a rather uncomfortable tipping point. A single government body, the US government, through a single institution, the US Federal Reserve, alongside some well-connected friends, are responsible for the creation, control, and manipulation of money. They want a money that is easily surveillable, continually inflated, and debased. To achieve this, there needs to exist a continual cycle of debt. Then there are the billions of the rest of us who spend most of our time thinking and worrying about money. We want a money that is the exact opposite, free, stable, and does not lose its purchasing power over time. We're going to answer two questions. How is money created? And how is money controlled and manipulated? First, we need to discuss those who are currently running the circus and how we ended up in such a mess. The rise of the US Federal Reserve, the Fed. In recent years, the Fed was repeatedly questioned about the rapid growth of money supply, debasement, and money printing. Chairman Jerome Powell dismissed the concerns, responding that a surge in the money supply wouldn't have important economic consequences. In a 2021 testimony, Mr. Powell said we should unlearn the fundamental models of economics. Inflation is transitory, no biggie. Contrary to this wisdom, inflation became a serious problem toward the end of 2021. They continued brushing off growing concerns while increasing the money supply through quantitative easing, we'll discuss later in the essay. During 2022, the chairman and other leaders of the Fed panicked and completely changed tune. Price inflation caused by debasement was in fact a huge problem that was no longer transitory. Rather than admit fault and develop a careful plan to address inflation and money supply, they aggressively raised interest rates and reduced money supply in an attempt to slow inflation. The sporadic actions caught banks by surprise who were engaged in risky lending. We'll explain this later in the essay also. By 2023, we had some of the biggest bank failures in American history. The Fed was then forced to bail out the large banks, placing the economy further down the dooming spiral of debt. Are these the people we want managing our money? The Fed was initially designed to provide the country with a stable financial system. In reality, the Fed is now the major lever through which the US empire is able to manipulate money in order to maintain its position as global superpower. It is a complicated beast, with many tentacles controlling every economy and government throughout the entire world. How the Fed is structured today. The Fed consists of two major entities, the Federal Reserve Board of Governors and 12 regional Federal Reserve banks. The Federal Reserve Board of Governors includes 7 members who are appointed by the US government for 14-year terms. They basically act as a federal government agency. Our friend mentioned earlier, Mr. Powell, holds the head honcho position. The 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, who act as bankers for their regions and put paper currency into circulation. The most important of these banks is the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. A combination of these two groups forms a 12-member FOMC. The FOMC consists of the 7 Federal Reserve Board of Governors, plus the head of the Federal Reserve New York branch, and the remaining 4 spots are shared between the 11 regional banks. You can think of the Fed as the broader central banking system and the FOMC as the major decision-makers of monetary policy within the Fed. They meet 8 times per year and set monetary policy for the US and basically the entire world. Fundamentals of the Fed and the FIAT financial system. Imagine a series of interconnected water storage systems. At the top, you have the government. Underneath the government, you have the Fed. Underneath the Fed, you have commercial banks, banks used by small businesses and people like you and me. A small number of entities, including the US government, sit at the top. They influence the creation and control of money. At the very bottom, you have us. The billions of people around the world with bank accounts, if we're lucky, who rely on money to interact each day. It's all beautifully and terrifyingly interconnected. Everyone has both assets and liabilities. Your assets include things like your bank balance. Your liabilities include things like loans you've taken from your commercial bank or taxes you owe the government. Commercial banks have assets, like loans lent and reserves it has stored with the central bank, and liabilities like your deposits. The central bank has assets like the loans it has made to the government or commercial banks, and liabilities like bank reserves stored by commercial banks. And then the government basically has a bank account directly with the Fed. It has assets like the taxes it extracts, and liabilities like loans it has taken from the central bank. There was a time when all the money in circulation needed to be backed by an equal and fixed amount of gold, the gold standard. Think of this as the same amount of water remaining in the system and flowing between the different water storage units, without any single entity having the divine right to add more pressure into the system. Today, the US empire is run by the government and the Fed engaged in a complicated relationship under the immense influence of large banks and institutions, relentlessly injecting more pressure into the system, and now we've reached breaking point. How is money created? Today, money is mostly created when new debt is created. Easier to understand through example. The year is 1923. You want to purchase a new car worth $1,000, but you've only managed to save $300, $700 short. Dressed in your Sunday best and hoping to make a good impression, you greet your local bank manager, Mr. Thompson, who knows you by name. You learn the bank's ability to lend money is constrained by the amount of gold the bank holds in its vaults. The bank must maintain a strict minimum of 10% gold to back customer deposits and lend more money. So Mr. Thompson inquires carefully about your job, your family, and your plans for the future. The interest rate is high, the repayment plan is short and challenging, and you need to offer up your home as collateral for the loan. Fast forward a century. The year is 2023. You want to purchase a new car worth $10,000, but you've only managed to save $3,000, $7,000 short. Rather than visit your local bank, you submit your loan application online. You are greeted by Thompson, the online bank portal's digital AI assistant. The government has long since removed the gold standard, and the Fed has recently slashed your bank's reserve requirements to zero. There are virtually no limitations on your bank's ability to lend you the money. In a few hours, your loan is approved with a relatively low interest rate. Remember that everyone has both assets and liabilities. But when your bank loans you the money, it's not coming from any existing reserves. No money is removed from the system, but the bank has increased its assets and the overall money supply. The bank is basically writing some magical IOUs. Today, a bank's primary objective is to take in as many deposits as possible and then turn those deposits into more loans, more debt, and repeat this until every last drop of profit has been squeezed before hitting the reserve limit. When you deposit your money at the bank, or someone else deposits money into your account, it feels as though this money is your money, being held there in safekeeping by your trusty bank. It's not. As soon as money hits your account, it magically transforms from you owning something real, something that should be a direct liability of the Fed, to a magical IOU, a fractional claim of a promise made by the US government. How is money controlled and manipulated? Today, the Fed and banks aren't limited by having to maintain any natural commodity like gold as a reserve. With the click of a mouse, money supply can be magically manipulated. Modern alchemy. But it's not quite as simple as switching on the money printer. Think of a thermostat. It controls the temperature of a room by turning on a heating or cooling system when the temperature gets too high or too low. But it has an interesting characteristic. It never reaches or maintains a perfect, consistent temperature. When inflation is too high, stuff gets too expensive. The Fed increases interest rates to discourage spending. When inflation is too low, stuff is relatively cheap. They decrease interest rates to encourage spending. When debt levels are really high, like they are now, manipulating interest rates isn't always enough to bring things back towards equilibrium. Interest rates are reduced to zero, and it's still not enough to stimulate borrowing and spending. In these situations, the government and Fed need to start working on a plan B. They artificially inject or remove money out of the system using fancy terms like quantitative easing or quantitative tightening. To really understand how money is manipulated, we need to understand two categorizations: base money and broad money. Base money is the physical currency in circulation and the cash reserves commercial banks hold with the Fed. Broad money is base money plus the massive amounts of bank deposits stored with commercial banks. The government and the Fed directly control and determine base money by deciding how much physical money is in circulation. They also decide the reserve amounts banks are required to maintain. But they do not directly control broad money. Confusing? Yes. All you really need to know is that broad money directly influences the economy as it is the money in circulation being used for transactions. This is a problem for both the Fed and the US government, who seek direct control. So, they indirectly influence broad money by allowing and encouraging the perpetual cycle of debt. What's next? So now we know that money is created, controlled, and manipulated in a complicated attempt to satisfy a number of different entities with different and often opposing objectives. During healthy banking environments and stable economies when everybody trusts each other, things work out okay. Big banks and financial institutions, investment management firms, technology companies, war material and ammunition suppliers, multinational pharmaceutical companies and the public all engage in a merry dance of lending, borrowing and debt creation. War and military spending, global pandemics and the growing need for social welfare fuel this fire. It's like a big game of musical chairs. When the entire system becomes over-leveraged, trust between financial institutions, the state and the public starts to diminish. Banks stop lending to each other, and the music stops. When the music stops, certain banks are left without chairs, i.e. they have no reserves and can't pay back their customers' deposits. The public panics, attempts to withdraw money, and the bank goes bankrupt. This is what happened earlier this year with Silicon Valley and a number of other banks in the US. But the show must go on. The government and the Fed need to ensure the game resumes to maintain control of money. So they restack the chairs and hit play. We experience the repercussions of these small cycles all the time. They are recessions, and they happen roughly every 6 years. In its attempts to manage an increasingly complicated empire, the US and the Fed have run up an unimaginable amount of debt. Sometimes the government borrows money to send directly to the public in the form of stimulus packages to repair damages caused by pandemics. Other times, it borrows money to increase bank reserves to allow them to keep lending. The repercussions of reckless and extensive debt creation cause a number of consequences. Sometimes the result is inflationary, sometimes it's anti-deflationary, sometimes it's deflationary. The tools and techniques are hidden behind increasingly confusing financial tools and jargon. Treasury securities, bonds, quantitative easing or tightening. The harsh reality is that at some point, the game can't just be reset with a recession.